We have breaking news out of the United States media. 60 Minutes on Sunday night just ran a major story, really just articulating the allegations made in the lawful, or I should say the legal complaint made by the government of Mexico against the American gun industry. The same case that is now before the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'm pretty sure is going to go bye-bye in favor of the Second Amendment. Let's break down the 60-minute story and make a few observations that I think you're going to want to know about to be the smartest person in the room. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the recent article in the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy. Make sure you download a free copy, share it with your friends, a 65-page detailed scholarly analysis of how to apply the Second Amendment to modern-day gun control law fights. All right, folks, so here's the story. So last night on CBS News, I broke down and I actually watched 60 Minutes, which I generally don't do because I think it's mostly nonsense. I don't think it's a great source for news anymore. Nevertheless, I decided to watch it as enemy research because I watched the segment they ran on the government of Mexico's accusations, that somehow the problem that the Mexican people suffer from with their cartels is exacerbated, I should say, by virtue of access to American firearms from American gun companies, such as companies like Smith & Wesson, which, as you know, are now being sued by the Mexican government with the support of Jonathan Lowy, a longtime gun control lawyer who I've debated on multiple occasions. And Jonathan Lowy was interviewed, articulating his views of the case and the situation. Now, I want to make some observations about the 60 Minutes story that I think is quite interesting. The first observation is before we even get to the substance of what was said. We've got a lot to say about the substance. It's not very persuasive in my opinion, but I want to talk about something more important to the Second Amendment community and what I sort of gleaned from this 60-minute story, and that's this. 60 Minutes is a marquee jewel of the CBS News empire. 60 Minutes is one of these prestige shows on TV, at least historically it has been, that everyone used to want to work for or write for or appear on. It was like a big deal. But I watched this segment very carefully because in addition to the fact that I'm a constitutional lawyer and Wall Street lawyer and all that fancy stuff and academic, I obviously have quite a bit of experience in the media because not only have I appeared in the national media countless times, including on CBS, I believe, as I recall. I think I've been interviewed by them. I've lost track over the years. And also I've represented a lot of talent, journalists and others who have negotiated contracts with various media outlets. I'm not going to name names, obviously, but I've been there and done that as well. The reason why I mention this is because I'm quite familiar with how the media world works, and I want to give you some positive news and almost a call to action for we in the Second Amendment community and in the conservative movement generally, and that's this. When I watched this segment on 60 Minutes, I said to myself, there's virtually no aspect of this report on 60 Minutes, Sunday night, CBS News, that by and large, most conservative, I'm talking like the higher end conservatives with some resources, conservative-oriented news outlets like The Federalist, Daily Wire, Daily Caller, the Epoch Times, Breitbarts of the world, you know what I mean? Even the Four Boxes Diner, frankly. I see no real reason why reporters or companies that want to do this kind of work cannot do the exact same level of reporting and work that 60 Minutes did. All this 60-minute segment consisted of, and then again, we're going to break down the substance of it in a moment, but I want to make this point because I want to inspire you and encourage you out there, companies like Stephen Gutowski and The Reload, to understand that a lot of what 60 Minutes does you can do too. Because if you look at this segment, and I'll try to put a link to it down in the description of this video. If you look at this segment, the only thing that it required to do this segment, from the perspective of a journalist doing the segment, producing the segment, was this. You needed some basic stock footage showing various crimes and activity in Mexico, some B-roll shots of people walking down the hallways and driving through the streets of Mexico and people walking around Mexico with guns. Basic footage that you could license and get through various companies out there already. Just sort of basic stock footage, which anyone could get access to if you just paid the price. Not a heavy lift. Then the only thing they did that was sort of unique was they interviewed Jonathan Lowy, an attorney representing Mexico. He explained his views that anyone presumably could get Jonathan Lowy or someone like a Jonathan Lowy to sit down for an interview and talk about their case. Okay. They also interviewed a former ATF official. Presumably there's ATF officials out there that anyone could interview on camera if they wanted to. And they interviewed one or two people, I think, down there in Mexico, just talking generically about the problems with the U.S. gun industry, which is just basically propaganda as far as I'm concerned, just anti-gun, anti-American propaganda by Mexican political figures. No big deal, that's fine. But the point is, at the end of the day, that was it. That's all it took to produce that segment. It took like 3 or 4 interviews of people in the know on the topic. Maybe they were biased in one way or another, doesn't matter, and some basically B-roll and stock footage. And you literally had the same, you could do the exact same work and produce the exact same segment. You could also maybe even make it pro-gun if you wanted to, right? Or pro-Second Amendment, because they didn't really interview anyone like that. And the journalist had some general narration of what was going on here, and that's it. The point is that mechanically speaking, there was nothing that I saw produced by 60 Minutes last night that you could not do if you had basic resources and a little bit of know-how of how this all works. And I'm optimistic, and this makes me happy, because when Elon Musk on X says that you and I, that we are the new media in many instances, I think that's largely true. And to the extent that you feel like you need something more and beyond that, you look at what 60 Minutes is producing, I see no reason why many people I follow on X and many companies could not do the exact same thing. So I just want to articulate, as a general matter, we in the Second Amendment community, we in the conservative community should recognize that it's not that hard, in my opinion, to replicate a lot of the quote-unquote reporting and news stories ginned up by the legacy media. Because if 60 Minutes, the crown jewel of CBS News, can do X, and we can do X as well, then what's the big deal? We should be doing that. So again, a little bit of inspiration and encouragement for our friends in the Second Amendment gun and media and conservative media space. If 60 Minutes can do it, we can do it too, and we should be doing it. Okay, now with that said, let's turn back to the substance of this segment by 60 Minutes. Well, obviously, it's certainly skewed in favor of gun control. There were some passing references to try to make it kind of balanced, but at the end of the day, it was really just articulating the viewpoints of the government of Mexico on the theories that we've covered on the show, where they are suing the gun industry and gun companies, basically in the District of Massachusetts, which is the world's worst court when it comes to guns, because the appellate court there is the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit out of Boston, Mass. Terrible court, so bad that everyone understands this. And it's interesting how that's where the government of Mexico decided to sue, which was strategically made sense. But now that case against the gun industry is before the United States Supreme Court, and I suspect the gun industry is going to win. What we're going to be cheering for there is a very broad holding, a very broad decision that it says that you simply cannot be held liable as a gun company for the criminal conduct of third parties over whom you have no control, and that is especially the case if you're dealing with criminals in the government, or I should say in the country of Mexico. So that's the first thing. There was a couple references to this case, but not a lot of discussion about it, other than some generic passing references to it. But probably I would have done a little bit more if I was doing the segment for 60 Minutes. Now, the second thing, of course, that sort of was alluded to and referenced, but I think also could have been built up, is the number of steps an illegal activity that has to be engaged in if you buy into this theory of the government of Mexico, which is, if you think about it, their argument is that a major gun company here in the United States, which is an FFL, has to have special licenses to manufacture firearms. They make firearms, they sell that gun pursuant to basic rules of the ATF and the Gun Control Act and whatnot, to a wholesaler who in turn, also an FFL, has to sell those guns to a retailer, and then the retailer has to sell those guns under federal law, to people who are not prohibited people. They have to fill out the 4473 forms, and they can't be blah, blah. You understand. There's an extensive set of laws that have to be complied with, any one of which, if you violate, you go to prison at the manufacturing level, to the wholesale level, to the retail level, and then the retailers, to the extent they sell guns to someone that turns out to be a criminal, but they don't know it, well, that's just the way it is. People commit crimes all the time. And if it turns out someone is engaged in a straw purchase of firearm at the retail level, they're committing a crime as well. And then if they sell that gun to people that are prohibited people, then you have even additional crimes. Then you throw on the idea that they're, according to the government of Mexico's argument at least, they're taking guns that were acquired through the FFL process in the United States, and then they're crossing the border from the United States into Mexico, which again, I don't believe, last I checked, you can be exporting firearms without a proper license, so you have even additional crimes being committed under American law. And then presumably when you get down to Mexico, if you start using these guns to traffic, let's say fentanyl, sex trafficking, you start shooting people or committing crimes in Mexico, now you're violating additional laws in Mexico. So somehow to say that a law-abiding gun manufacturer at the top of the food chain, which is monitored extensively, not just by the ATF, for example, but all sorts of other government agencies, including if you're a publicly traded, meaning your stock is publicly traded, like some of these gun companies are publicly traded companies. You even have government regulators like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, monitoring you as well. So you have all these people monitor this entire chain of custody, if you will, this whole body of commerce, and in America, and then down in Mexico, and somehow crimes committed, murders committed in Mexico are somehow to blame on American gun manufacturers. It's simply absurd. And I think that's what the Supreme Court is going to say. But let's even step back further. One other thing the 60-minute segment did not talk about was, of course, the Fast and Furious debacle. In that situation, for those of you who may have forgotten this, it actually got Eric Holder, the Attorney General, held in contempt of Congress, but of course the Department of Justice did nothing vis-a-vis that. The Department of Justice did nothing vis-a-vis Eric Holder, and unlike what they did with Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, where they put them in prison for contempt of Congress and all that, that's the kind of double two systems of justice that we've talked about before. If Eric Holder, an Obama appointee, gets held in contempt of Congress, nothing happens to him. But if Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon get held in contempt of Congress, they get to go to prison. That's the two systems of justice we're hoping the Trump administration will get fixed. But beyond that, the reason why I bring up the Fast and Furious story is, you may recall, this is a situation where the ATF literally engaged in gun walking, where they took American guns and essentially had them trafficked over the border of Mexico into Mexico. And the theory, at least, as I understand it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the theory was that these guns in Mexico that went from the United States to Mexico at the urging and encouragement and causation of the activities of the ATF itself would somehow be, either they could be tracked down to Mexico, they could be tracked to see where the cartels were going, or whatever it was. That was one theory, but my understanding is, at least what I've been told, is that the tracking devices ran out of batteries and they lost track of the guns in Mexico. So the question, of course, is, of the guns that 60 Minutes is reporting on that were somehow involved in some crime in Mexico but came from the United States, one has to ask the question, how many of those guns, if any, actually arose from Fast and Furious and were actually trafficked to Mexico by virtue of the ATF itself, and not by virtue of the normal channels of commerce. Now, of course, beyond that, we have to get realistic here. Now, let's step back for a moment. Cartels are not small-time thugs. This is very important to understand. You're going to understand why in a second. They are not small-time thugs. If you're a small-time gangbanger operating on some street corner in Chicago selling, some illicit drug or something like that, yeah, you can have a girlfriend or some friend go in and maybe do a straw purchase and acquire a gun or two that way, because you're like a small-time felon thug kind of guy. And fine, okay, not good, it's illegal, you go to prison and all that. But the reality is, when you're dealing with the cartels in Mexico, you're dealing with sophisticated operations. They're not just buying a handful of firearms to be cool on the streets of Chicago to impress their neighbors and intimidate a few drug-addled individuals on the street corner. No, if you're dealing with the Mexican cartels, you're dealing with sophisticated organizations. These cartels acquire weapons by the warehouse, okay? They are buying javelin, shoulder-fired rockets in the form of javelins. They want belt-fed Gatling guns and belt-fed machine guns. They have drones. They have landmines. These cartels are acquiring weapons and ammunition in quantities massively more than you could ever acquire through, an occasional straw purchase that could occur on the border in some, town there in Arizona or Texas. And keep in mind that America is not the only source for weapons in the world. If you're the Mexican cartels, why would you want to mess around with some straw purchases, right, to acquire a handful of guns from America, who's trying to prosecute these crimes, who's trying to put people in prison, that doesn't like the cartels as a general matter, okay? Why would you mess around with that when you can literally go to the Chinese, to the North Koreans, to Asian countries, to South American countries perhaps, to other countries that maybe are not as keen on the rule of law, and they're far more interested just as supplying weapons to Mexico. In fact, it's my understanding from talking to individuals that seem to be in the know that in many instances, Asian manufactured, not all, but many, if not most, Asian manufactured AK-47s, for example, have no serial numbers. And they're happy to supply these weapons to the cartels. I mean, why would North Korea or China care about supplying weapons to the cartels? They're not trying to, do anything with the cartels. If anything, they'd like to make money off the cartels and supply them. And if they can harass American gun owners and the United States and somehow get American gun owners disarmed, even better, because there's nothing that the Chinese and the Russians and countries that hate us would like better than for American citizens to be disarmed, because that would make us a lot more likely to be able to be invaded and taken over, or alternatively, to make our American soldiers less familiar with firearms and thus less good shots and less good soldiers, none of which is good for American national interest or national security, but would be something exactly the sort of thing that our foreign adversaries like the Russians or Chinese would encourage or like. So with that said, there's only one more point I want to make about this 60-minute story. They pointed out something we've talked about before, which is in the country of Mexico. This is an amazing fact. In the country of Mexico, there is only one, you heard me right, folks, one gun store on an army base, I think outside Mexico City. One. Now, here's what's interesting. The 60 Minutes says that Mexican's constitution, listen how they did this game. They said Mexico's constitution does indeed guarantee a right to keep and bear arms, but it's full of all these governmental regulations and make it very hard to get guns. So again, a paper tiger that says you have a right to keep and bear arms, but of course, if the government can step in the way and make it very difficult to exercise that right, it's really no right at all. It's at most a privilege. And that, of course, is where anti-gunners want to move the United States, where we have on paper, it's a right to keep and bear arms. But in the real world, they want that paper right to be nothing more than exactly that, a paper tiger with no teeth that does nothing in terms of enforceability. Because as I've explained before, there's no such thing as a right without a remedy. Hear what I just said? There is no right without a remedy. If we can, if they tell us we have the right to keep and bear arms, but we have no ability to enforce it, then we basically have no right to keep and bear arms. And that is the world in which the anti-gunners, the government of Mexico, and a lot of our foreign enemies really want the United States to move to, where a right to keep and bear arms is not a right, it's disappeared, and we, as American citizens, no longer are citizens. We're simply serfs. We're subject. We're peons. That is the world that many people on the left want us to move to. And I'm happy to report that at least with the election of Donald Trump and the control of the Senate by Republicans, and hopefully strong, robust fortitude, by the U.S. Supreme Court encouraged this year, will ensure the right to keep and bear arms will continue robustly and in a protected fashion for many years to come. All right, folks. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's discussion of the 60 Minutes episode. I'll try to put a link to it down below. Make sure you follow me on X at 4boxes. Don't forget, please follow me and subscribe over there on Rumble. We got like 600 people on Rumble where I'm trying to at least have a presence over there because I know a lot of people don't like YouTube. So I've added my videos to Rumble. So, make sure you check that out. And I look forward to talking to you all again real soon here at the 4boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.